Hey, how are you?
Hi, Chris. How are you?
I am good. I'm good.
I can't quite see you, but
How's that?
perfect. I'm joined by Pulitzer Prize and award-winning journalist and author Chris Hedges. How are you, Chris? Thanks for coming on the show. It's good to have you.
Not at all. Good. Thanks.
Chris, what is all this then with Trump finally conceding and saying that he'll allow, so to speak, this transition to Biden?
I don't know if he's officially given up, although you're right. Tacitly, he's given up by allowing the release of funds for Biden's transition team. I think he will continue to slog the mantra of fraud and rigged elections, and I don't think he'll ever acknowledge that he lost the vote. But I think it does, as you point out, indicate that he isn't going to try. I mean, he would have liked to carry out a kind of coup by getting state legislators to appoint electors in violation of the vote. But it was just it wasn't close. If it was just one state and it was 500 and some votes, as you saw in Florida with 2,000, he might have been able to pull it off. I mean, George W. Bush did. But
Yeah.
it was just logistically too difficult, and he's too unfocused and disorganized to do it anyway.
What do you think is going to happen in terms of his base? Do you think that they're going to let this go? Because, we just had to endure 4 years of Russiagate from the Democrats. So, I mean, are we going to have the same kind of rhetoric from the Republican or Trump base for the next 4 years?
Yeah. Although, I mean, I don't, the Democrats are as bad as the Republicans. So what happens in 2016, Hillary Clinton immediately blames Russia, as does the Democratic Party hierarchy. I mean, she writes in her book with no evidence that Russia hacked into the electoral systems and diverted or altered votes. She calls Jill Stein, a 2016 Green Party candidate, a Russian asset. She insists to this day, despite the fact that the Mueller report never found any evidence of collusion between Moscow and the Trump campaign, that there was a coordinated effort with the Russians. And now, of course, with Trump losing, we're seeing the same kind of ludicrous assertions from Giuliani and Powell. She's no longer part of the legal team, that it was Venezuelan voting software designed by Hugo Chavez. But it's really both sides of the elites are culpable in refusing to acknowledge, because they're both responsible for the rage that is legitimately ripping across the country. And so they use this notion of foreign interference as a way to deflect attention from their own complicity in deindustrialization and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a tiny oligarchic elite, and trade deals and programs of austerity and wholesale surveillance and militarized police and the largest prison system in the world, 25% of the world's prisoners, although we're 4% of the world's population. So it's a familiar tactic. But of course, I find so frightening is the media is playing along. The media itself is now bifurcated, including old traditional outlets such as the New York Times.
But isn't this weird? Because we heard that Russia and China and Iran were all interfering in the election, and now Biden is one. Does that mean that they were helping Biden? I mean, what are we supposed to believe?
No. They've already told us that it's proof that the democratic system works and that the will of the people were ratified. It is quite amazing, and nobody's uttering a word about Russia or China or any. I mean, let's be clear that there is massive interference in every electoral campaign in the United States by a foreign power, and that's Israel, which uses its lobbying group to lavishly fund candidates and provides, because they're exempt from all sorts of laws, these junkets where they fly Congress members and their families to seaside resorts. And then in 2015, of course, you had Netanyahu never even inform Obama to go before the Congress and denounced Obama's nuclear deal. So there is interference, a foreign interference in our elections. It's just neither party ever wants to mention which country that is.
Yeah, that was absolutely astounding what Netanyahu did. I mean, the audacity of it. Chris, what do you make of Joe Biden's cabinet so far? It's not complete yet, but he's put Blinken as his Secretary of State and Ron Klain as White House Chief of Staff. What do you make of these appointments?
I'm just stunned that anybody in the liberal elite or the progressive community is surprised. Who do they think funded the campaign? These massive donations from Eric Schmidt and others in Silicon Valley in this PAC that created a torrent of anti-Trump ads in the final weeks of the campaign to elect Biden. He got more corporate money than Trump. It wasn't done because these corporations and billionaires love democracy. They knew Biden would serve their interests, and I'm not in any way surprised. I'm just surprised that other people are surprised.
What do you make of this farce that we keep hearing that, once Biden is elected, we'll be able to push him left?
Yeah, well, there's only one way to push people left, and that's if you've got a bank account with hundreds of millions of dollars. And since we don't, there is no pressure. We have no pressure. The corporate powers, long ago bought our elections overtly and through dark money. And that is the problem. And Biden is a product of it. Obama didn't take public financing. McCain did, but Obama didn't. And they get what they pay for. So, all of this was completely predictable. And I think exposes the kind of naivete from liberals and progressives who somehow think that, Biden is going to listen to them. And no, Biden has a long track record. We know where he stands on all of these issues. That's why he was anointed. I mean, remember during the primary, the big donors in the Democratic Party, like Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, made it very clear that if Bernie Sanders was the nominee, which they were never going to allow to happen, they'd vote for Trump. So the whole least worst mantra, the lesser evil mantra, doesn't apply to them. It just applies to us.
So, Chris, I was watching one of your interviews and you were talking about learning to have empathy for the suffering of others. And you refer to privilege as blindfold or blindness.
Right. Well, privilege is blindness. I mean, especially if you're white and male and American. And so I spent 2 decades in the developing world, places like Central America, 7 years in the Middle East. And I speak Spanish and I speak Arabic. I spent months of my life in Gaza. And I learned that, that coming from a privileged position means you don't see. So I worked as hard as I could to understand what it was like to be a Palestinian in Gaza, but I knew it was finally impossible to grasp truly what it meant to live in the world's largest open-air prison. And I think that if you respect that gulf between you and oppressed peoples, you can have real relationships. But it's personal for me. When Barack Obama got up in 2016 in front of AIPAC and delivered a speech which looked as if it could have been written by AIPAC, I said, I don't care if I'm the only one. I'm not betraying the Palestinians. I teach in a prison. I've been teaching in New Jersey prisons for a decade. I can't walk out that door and vote for someone like Joe Biden. Half of my students wouldn't be in the class but for Joe Biden. He was the architect, along with Clinton, of the 1994 omnibus crime bill that not only almost doubled the prison population, but tripled and quadrupled sentences, increased, I think, to 51 under federal law, the number of crimes that merit the death penalty, which he used to brag about, militarized the police. This was Biden, and it has consequences, and had and continues to have consequences on people I care about. And I think that disconnect from the liberal elite, from the suffering that imperial power and police brutality and legal system that railroads poor people into jails and prisons is part of what, of course, destroys all of their credibility. I mean, in the short term, getting rid of Trump, I didn't want Trump around any more than anyone else. In the short term, you sell out, in essence, every position that you purport to stand for to support the Democratic Party, which in Europe would be considered a far-right party, and you get Biden. But in the long term, it's very dangerous because what you've shredded is your credibility. You've proven that you will fight and stand for nothing. And what we will see after Trump leaves office is an enraged his base, millions of people who truly believe, because they live in their own echo chambers, the way we live, the liberal class lives in echo chambers, the CNN or NPR or MSNBC or the New York Times. I mean, the Pew Research Center did studies this summer. 91% of the readership of the New York Times identifies as supporters of the Democratic Party, 87% for NPR, 95% for MSNBC. And then, of course, you've got the other side, 95% of those who watch Fox identify as being members of the Republican Party. But if you can't speak across that divide, if there's no way to communicate, then you flirt, and I think we're already flirting with acts of violence directed at, because of these weird conspiracy theories, the deep state, people like Dr. Fauci, and of course, mainstream Democratic candidates who will be blamed by, this segment of the population for rigging and stealing the election, as well as the media outlets that serve the interests of the Democratic Party. And they're not wrong. Those media outlets, during this campaign did absolutely everything possible to shut down information that was damaging to Joe Biden. And that just wasn't just the data that was on Hunter Biden's discarded laptop, but Biden's connections to China and his taped conversation with the former president of the Ukraine. And then, of course, they kept referring to the Podesta emails as in the New York Times as misinformation. It's not misinformation. They're real. I mean, so that's what frightens me. The country is now bifurcated into antagonistic factions that can't communicate. And that is a recipe for very serious social disintegration, which, of course, I witnessed in the former Yugoslavia.
Just going back quickly to what you were saying about this idea of selling out in the short term to Biden, all of these progressives that said people should vote for Biden and the new ones who just got elected too, who also happen to be, claim to be progressives, but are also supporting the oppression of Palestinians. I mean, can we consider them a real opposition? Because 100 years ago in the U.S., you had a coalition, socialists, communists. They were using direct action, general strikes to achieve change. And we're not seeing any of that anymore.
Well, the left has been decimated. The liberal class has sold out. That's what my book, The Death of the Liberal Class, is about. I mean, people like Clinton or Obama or Biden are not liberals. They self-identify as liberals. But the Clinton administration made a very calculated move to become the Republican Party, which they did. And then they pushed the Republicans so far to the right, they became insane. That's what happened. So and all of the mechanisms by which popular will could be expressed, especially unions, were wiped out.
And I mean, what do you think of the progressive, like the Squad and Bowman and all these new players, so to speak? Because, they appeared to have some kind of fire in them when they first got elected, and now they just roll over. You look at all these votes in the last year.
Yeah, but they don't have any power in the Democratic Party. But when the media essentially needs to exacerbate that divide, to play to one demographic and to set one demographic against another demographic, they're a useful media foil. So they have zero influence within the Democratic Party establishment. But they're seized upon by the media because they are the foil for the divide. But they're a handful of members who don't in any way, as I think should be evident, have any influence on Democratic Party policy. And then, of course, if they get out of line, since the power of a Pelosi or Schumer or Mitch McConnell is that they are the conduit by which you get money to run for re-election, they're punished and targeted.
So with this Hunter Biden story, how it was repressed, New York Post getting their Twitter account locked, and Glenn Greenwald leaving The Intercept, all these things, how the entire media apparatus protected Joe Biden and the Biden camp so vehemently. I mean, what do you think the next 4 years is going to look like, especially for people with adversarial points of view, dissenters?
Well, we know what it's going to look like. That who goes after the progressive independent journalists? It's the Democratic Party, because we call them out for who they are. And so, for instance, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy told CNN, these are his words, that the Russian disinformations are, quote unquote, more problematic than in 2016 because, again, quoting, this time around, the Russians have decided to cultivate U.S. citizens as assets and are attempting to spread their propaganda in the mainstream media. So we saw the digital platforms in collusion with these Democratic Party media outlets essentially push dissenters to the sidelines, and WikiLeaks is that kind of template for that. When I was writing for TruthDig before we all went on strike, when the publisher tried to fire Bob Scheer, and then we all got fired. But we charted those algorithms. So impressions, which means, like, for instance, if you went into Google and typed in imperialism, and I'd written a story about imperialism a few days before, normally it would come up. But they divert you away from alternative sites towards the mainstream sites, such as the New York Times or CNN or something like that. So that's what we're going to see a lot more of. There's going to be, especially as things unravel and the Democratic Party is unable to cope with both the fallout from the economic fallout from the pandemic and the pandemic itself. I mean, part of the problem with the pandemic is that our for-profit healthcare system is just not capable of dealing with a national health crisis. It's not designed to. These media outlets want to retain their monopoly, and they're kind of cheering on this censorship. I mean, we saw in the New York Times this amazing story by Kevin Roos and Mike Isaac and Shara Frankel on the Facebook deliberations over how to alter algorithms, and they said it's great because, of course, it profits them. I'm talking about the New York Times, and they claim in the New York Times that it diverts people away from hyper-partisan pages like Breitbart or Occupy Democrats, and of course the conceit is that CNN or the New York Times or NPR or MSNBC are not hyper-partisan, which is ridiculous. So that's what we're going to see. I think we'll see increasing social unrest, and we'll see increasing marginalization orchestrated and cheered on by the Democrats and those media platforms that function as propaganda outlets for the Democrats against people who call the Democrats out for their malfeasance.
You wrote also that Biden's assault on civil liberties, I suspect, will surpass those of the Obama administration.
Yeah, well, that's precisely what I'm talking about. So Obama uses the Espionage Act, I believe, 9 times to shut down whistleblowers, including Snowden. Obama passes Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which overturns the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, which had prohibited the military from being used as a domestic police force. Obama gets his lawyers to, I think, misinterpret the Authorization to Use Military Force Act as giving the executive the right to serve as judge, jury, and executioner and order the assassination of American citizens, and I'm talking about Anwar al-Awlaki, in Yemen, because they're terrorists. That was all Obama, not to mention the drones and everything else. So that will be not only continued, but if the Democratic Party feels threatened because of social upheaval, will be amplified and expanded. That's what I expect.
I was in London at the Old Bailey. I covered the Assange hearing, and people asked me if I think that Julian Assange will be pardoned under a Biden administration. I mean, I don't even know how to answer that, because what the prosecution was trying to assert in court was that Obama did not specifically rule out prosecuting Assange, like as if they were proud of it almost. So I mean, I'm just sitting there and I don't even know what to answer.
Well, there's a word for people like that. It's called clueless.
Yeah, it's absurd. I mean,
it's a completely absurd. I mean, but it by endowing Biden and the Democrats with all sorts of qualities they don't have, and embracing a kind of self-delusional hope, then they don't have to do anything, and they're not going to do anything. I mean, look, the whole censorship and manipulation that we're enduring was tested, honed, and perfected on WikiLeaks. I mean, they were the canary in the coal mine. So WikiLeaks tries to release information, it's hit with botnets or distributed denial of service attacks. Malware is constantly attacking the domain and the website to shut it down. It can't serve its contents to readers. Every time WikiLeaks tries to hold a press conference, the audio is distorted, the visual is distorted. You either delayed getting in or you can't get in at all. They got all sorts of algorithms to block the dissemination of information released by WikiLeaks. All the hosting services like Amazon have removed WikiLeaks. And then after Julian Assange released the Iraqi war logs, what happened to him personally? His bank accounts were shut down. His credit cards were frozen. WikiLeaks PayPal accounts were disabled to cut off donations. I mean, the Freedom of Press Foundation closed down its anonymous funding channel, which had been set up to protect the anonymity of donors. And then you got the smear campaign against Julian, which was amplified by the very immediate publications like The Guardian, the New York Times, that had published the material he released. Alex Gibney made that horrible film about him. And now Julian's sitting in a high security prison, waiting potentially to be extradited, where he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. So that's, Assange, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks were first, but we're next. That's what's coming.
Indeed. And that's something a lot of people fail to understand. What do you think of this notion that we're hearing that, if Donald Trump really wants to stick it to the establishment, that he could pardon Assange and Snowden on the way out? Do you think that's likely at all?
No, I think what's far more likely is that he's conspiring with Benjamin Netanyahu to bomb Iran. That's what I worry about. But the idea that he's going to pardon, remember, Pompeo hates WikiLeaks. Yep. I don't see that. And I would be highly surprised if that happened. I think that the far more likely scenario is that, and there's some indication that Iran is, or Israel has spent the last few weeks preparing for strikes on Iran. I covered the Middle East, and the air defense system in Iran is quite good. And the Israeli Air Force, which I believe is the fourth largest in the world, as big as it is, cannot hit targets in Iran unless it has the U.S. Air Force to knock out the missile technology that can bring down Israeli planes. So this was raised with the Bush administration after the elections of 2008 in that interregnum before Obama took power. And the Pentagon was adamant against it. because Iran had sent a very clear message that if they were attacked, even if it was only by Israeli planes, they would wipe out the US targets in Iraq. And at the time, there was quite a large number of American troops in Iraq. I mean, the green zone would just not exist. And they have the missile capability to do that. So it was that threat and the Pentagon's distaste for taking on Iran that stopped it. But that's my worry. That is my biggest worry. I would be highly surprised if he, that would fulfill all of, I would, make my Christmas, but if Julian was pardoned, but I don't expect it.
Yeah, I think Mike Pompeo, in 2017, he referred to WikiLeaks as a, quote, non-state hostile intelligence service. I think those were his exact words.
That's right.
So that's why I thought this would be impossible. Chris, on the issue of Israel. So, you were the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. You lived in Palestine. تحكي عربي كمان صح؟
شوية.
My cousin is Palestinian, half Syrian, half Palestinian. When I told him I'm bringing you on, he's a huge fan, he's very excited. He wanted me to ask you specifically about the Kushner plan, the Abraham Accords, the Netanyahu annexation plan. Do you think any of these are going to take place under Biden? And what are your personal thoughts on a two-state solution or a one-state solution?
Well, what will happen under Biden is what happened under Trump, which is nothing. Rhetoric, but they're not going to move the embassy. But remember, Chuck Schumer supported the move of the embassy to Jerusalem. So what they'll do is, the usual kind of rhetoric, but do nothing. Israel, all during the Obama administration, expanded the settlements, seized more and more territory, carried out these murderous assaults in Gaza. Yeah. At which the U.S. had the audacity to sit around the Obama administration and call a war. Look, when you attack people who are hemmed in, with fighter jets and, the Palestinians don't have an air force. They don't have heavy artillery. They don't have mechanized units. They don't have command and control. You can't call that a war. That's, let's call it what it is. It's murder. And that won't change. That won't change under Biden. Maybe the progressives will get to him, and he'll support BDS.
Yeah, maybe in a million years. It's actually unbelievable because if you look at the DNC platform committee, Joe Biden personally intervened to remove the word occupations just a few months ago. What is your personal opinion, having lived there, having seen the atrocities being committed, about a two-state solution? Do you think the Israelis ever had a plan for a two-state solution, given these annexation that are trying to continue now?
So, I used to argue about this with my good friend Robert Fisk, who unfortunately just died. Fisk never bought into Oslo. He said that it was just a con. It was a way for the Israelis to bring back Arafat and the PLO, who would establish a kind of colonial police force on behalf of the Israelis. That was always the plan, that they would retain the borders, everybody would be trapped inside, and they'd just be like, ghettos, Bantustans, call them in South Africa. So townships, except as far as I know, the ANC didn't send fighter jets to bomb townships. I was probably, looking back on it, I, of course, covered Rabin. I knew Rabin. I was cautiously more hopeful, but I think what Bob said is proven to be the case, clearly. I don't see a way out. I think the only way out is to do to Israel what we did to South Africa, which is sanctions. That's the only language that's going to work, which is why I'm a very vocal and public supporter of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, and had to take on my good friend, Noam Chomsky, who I admire immensely, in a public event in San Francisco, because he doesn't support BDS, but I do.
And Unfortunately, I don't see that ever happening in the near future, at least not in the U.S. The efforts by the Zionist lobby are quite incredible.
Yeah, but they're scared by it. They are scared of it. They pump tremendous resources to try and break it down not because it succeeds. I mean, these institutions aren't going to divest, but as a consciousness raising technique. So that's why they're retreating in the arms of the Christian right, people like Mike Pompeo, because every time I speak at universities, I always meet for students in Justice and Palestine groups. Half of them are Jewish. So they've just lost, the kind of emotional ties and loyalty among young Jews. And they're kind of frantic about it. So they're very worried about it. And you see even ruptures within the Democratic Party establishment itself. I mean, Bernie Sanders in 2016 actually wasn't very good on Israel, but he got a lot better because his base kind of said you have to.
What are your thoughts on what just happened with Corbyn being suspended from the Labour Party in the UK and the smear campaign against him for the last years?
Well, that's precisely what's going to happen. I mean, the whole idea that Corbyn is anti-Semitic is, about as credible as the fact that Hugo Chavez software stole the election for Joe Biden. I mean,
yeah.
But it's sad. We forget that within the Labour Party, the Blairites still had tremendous control. They hated Corbyn. They were determined to destroy him. I'm talking about during the election. And that's, by the way, what would have happened to Bernie. So in 1972, when George McGovern ran, the hierarchy of the Democratic Party worked in concert with the hierarchy of the Republican Party to elect Nixon and destroy McGovern, which they did. And you saw the same thing with Corbyn. And that's clearly what would have happened if Bernie would have gotten the nomination. But the system was so fixed internally that was never possible, which is why I was critical of Bernie. He should have run as an independent, not because he would have won, but because we could have begun to build the foundation of a movement, an independent movement by which we could fight back. But he didn't want to take the risk. And I know because I talked to him, he didn't want to take the risk. He didn't want to end up a pariah like Ralph Nader, who I admire immensely. He didn't want to lose his Senate seat in Vermont because they would have actually run a credible candidate, funded it lavishly to run against him. He's independent, but he caucuses with the Democrats, so he has seniority. Yeah, he's not morally or temperamentally fit to lead this fight, and I think he's proven it.
So, I mean, essentially speaking, if you look at the UK and the US, the Labour Party, the Democratic Party, these are not opposition parties anymore. There is no more opposition. Where do we go from here? What do you think is the future for the left in both of these countries now that, the establishment has taken over both parties?
Well, I think, mass civil disobedience, which is why I've been supportive of Extinction Rebellion. I think building third parties, but in the United States, I don't know the UK as much, but I mean, there's a little more latitude in terms of more than two parties in the UK. But in the US, and I worked with Ralph, they're just the two ruling parties just conspire to crush, challenge voter lists, keep you off the debates. I mean, the debate commission in the United States is run by the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and it's designed to keep third party voices out. And if you're not awash in money, you can't get advertising, you can't get heard. So, I mean, Ralph, he would go to Madison Square Garden and 10,000 people would show up, which is a lot for a rally. And Bernie had big rallies too, but he never had the money to amplify that on the media, which was very hostile to him from the beginning. So I think we have to put most of our energy into sustained mass civil disobedience and have a political expression of that through third-party movements. I know Roger Hallam's now pushing Burning Pink, but certainly within the United States, the idea that we're going to wrest power from the ruling elites through the electoral process is, a fantasy.
What do you expect to see under Biden's administration in regards to the Middle East, because, when I bring up Syria, which is where I was born, I basically get told to shut up, that, it's the lesser of two evils. And, these drones are solar powered and they have rainbows on them. I mean, I really have a tough time understanding people who can't see that the imperialism will continue regardless who's president. I'd like to get your thoughts on that, because you've been in journalism your whole life and you've covered politics under multiple administrations. You were in the Middle East and you've lived in the global South. Do you see this changing one iota?
Not at all. And it didn't change under Obama. It's not going to change under Biden. The military industrial complex, as it's correctly called, is beyond the control of anyone, including Trump. All of these generals and politicians who got us into these wars should all be hauled up and put on trial. Instead, they're all promoted. Their policies are embraced every year. The defense budget is gargantuan. The wars never end because to a few people they're profitable. And remember that the press doesn't cover this anymore. Most Americans have no idea what's being done in their name in countries like Afghanistan or Syria, or that carnage is so censored out from the American media landscape that it's just not even on the radar screen. It's not a reality. And I think that's part of my anger, because, having spent so much time on the outer reaches of empire and seeing how venal and brutal and the kinds of atrocities that it carries out day in and day out against poor people. I mean, empire is really the external expression of white supremacy. It's about subjugating and killing poor people of color and stealing their resources. That's what empire is. But it's not, the whole media landscape has changed so dramatically from when I began covering the conflicts in Central America in the early 80s. All of the networks had a bureau. I mean, the papers like the Philadelphia Inquirer had correspondents, Baltimore Sun. It's all gone. It's all gone. And we don't see it. I mean, media is so commercially driven. It's just feeding you happy thoughts, and it's looping back to you your own proclivities and prejudices, and that's what makes money, and that's what they're doing. So no, absolutely nothing will change, either for the Palestinians or anyone else in the Middle East, and sadly.
Yes, definitely. Chris, just before I let you go, you told me you're working on a new book. Can you tell us more and when it comes out?
So the book is, I teach in the New Jersey prisons through Rutgers University in their college degree program. And in 2013, I taught a class of 28 students in East Jersey State Prison and helped them write a play about their lives, both inside prison and outside prison, which was called Caged, which was eventually performed in the theater in Trenton and published. And so I use the process of writing that play, because nothing in the play, everything in the play is autobiographical. It happened to one of my students. And I use the play to talk about the horror of mass incarceration, what it has done to them, what it's done to their families. And it works. It's a kind of narrative arc or a vehicle to expose the savagery of the American penal system. The book was supposed to be out in the spring, but because of COVID, everything's delayed. So it'll be out next fall in 2021.
Okay, that's wonderful. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you so much for all your work and your time. I'm really grateful having you on the show, and thankful to Nyla as well. So really appreciate it. Thank you.
Not at all. I'm happy to do it. Okay, ma salama.
Ma salama. Take care. Bye-bye.